So Mark, let's jump right in. Mark and I have known each other for a long time, and Mark, I know before we both clerked for Judge Norton that you were in the Navy, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, why don't you give us a little bit about your background and how Charleston became your home?
Yeah, as Eddie mentioned, like many folks, we moved here as a Navy family. So again, Dad retired as a Navy captain and then became probably the best Charleston County administrator we've ever had in Charleston, and then ran for county council. But that established our roots here. Went to Bishop England, went off to Chapel Hill, but like many of us, always felt that draw to come back to the pluff mud of the Low Country. Right? You just can't ever leave it. So after 6 years on active duty, I came back to USC Law School. Really decided I wanted to practice in Charleston. And like you, was just incredibly fortunate to get our first job to work for Judge Norton.
You mentioned the Navy, and I know we've got a projection, the book, Lessons from the Admiral, and I, along with many others, first thought that the Admiral was you, and as I started reading the book, I realized it is not Mark, and I had so many questions. Who is the Admiral? What were you doing in the Navy at that time? What time was it? Does he know about the book? Why isn't he named in the book? So you can't take off the lawyer hat sometimes. So peppering you with all of those questions, why don't you answer some of them?
That's a great deposition, or a bunch of questions from the bench, right? For those of us in the legal community. And you can tell we're both lawyers because our books are peppered with tabs. So, the judge said, "Do you think anybody's going to care if our books are tabbed?" I said, "Oh, it shows we're prepared." My last job in the Navy, active duty, I worked as an admiral's aide. It was either stay in Jacksonville and become an instructor, which I really thought would be wonderful, or move to Brunswick, Maine and become an admiral's aide. I had a JAG lawyer say, "Hey, you need to go be the admiral's aide." And I said, "I'm not going to Brunswick, Maine. It's too cold, right? I'm from Charleston. I like Jacksonville." He said, "You'd be great at it. It's a great job." And I interviewed, and that was one of those interviews that if you interview it and you get the job, you can't say no thanks, right? But if you get offered the job, that's the job you take. And I was very fortunate. I interviewed for the job as the Admiral's aide. He was the Admiral over our entire community of East Coast P3s. So we had about 16 squadrons on the East Coast, 6 of them in Jacksonville, 6 of them back in the day in Brunswick, Maine, right? Because remember, this is the height of the Cold War. We're flying all over the world tracking submarines. So that's how I got to him. I realized that at the end of those 18 months and some 15, 20 years later, I was still doing things every day that I had done in that job. It just kept banging around in my head. I said, wouldn't it be neat if I could put these in a book? And thank goodness we all had a lot of benefits with the pandemic, and the pandemic drove me in the solace to write the book. And didn't name him because I wanted people to have their own vision of who he was. I didn't want his picture to be in there. And the other interesting fact was I felt like if I named him as a good aide, even a former aide, I would have to send him the manuscript and ask for approval. And I didn't want to have to do that. There's nothing in there that's embarrassing. But at the same time, I didn't want him thinking he could override my stories. The good news is right before Thanksgiving, I booked a one-way flight. I went up to Norfolk, Virginia, where he is, and presented him a copy of the book, and he and his family have been both overjoyed and have ordered more of them. So that's the Admiral.
All right, well, I love that he says there's nothing embarrassing in the book. Nothing embarrassing about the Admiral. There are a couple of lessons that you learn from some mistakes with the Admiral. I'm teasing. It's not embarrassing. It's actually very helpful in terms of the learning process and the things that you learned from the Admiral. I just couldn't pass up an opportunity to tease you.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you read the book, there were times when I was the Admiral's third aide. The first aide he had fired, and he didn't tell me why he fired the first aide until about 6 months later. And every time I made a mistake, I would look at him and he'd say, "Don't worry, I'm not going to fire you today." And then one time, I'm driving around with him in the car, and those who were in the Marine Corps, former Marines saved me that day, because as I'm driving, the Admiral wants to go look at boats at the marina. We've got some extra time. He says, "Pull over there, let's go look at the marina." Yeah. And I said, "Okay, we're in this old white K car, right? Those were the government cars back then." And as I'm making a U-turn, I go go over the off-ramp that goes down into the water, and the front two wheels ride off the front of the off-ramp and go kerchunk. And it's front-wheel drive, and the car just sits there. And I go, oh my God. And we're both in uniform. And I'm thinking, this is not good. And he looks at me, and I say in the book, I said, the Admiral did not cuss. He looked at me and said, damn it, Mark, we're stuck. And a Marine saved the day. So Marines, Neil, there's a chapter in there for the Marines.
I love it. There are nuggets like that throughout the book that are just fabulous lessons to learn from. And we'll talk about a few more later on. But tell us what, I know you talked about using the time in the pandemic to write the book, but what inspired you to write this?
Yeah, I think, we talked a little bit about this before, Judge, the fact that so many of us are, mentoring the younger generation, and they're not supposed to say younger at work. They say, I'm supposed to call it early career, I think, right? And I just thought it would be wonderful if I could pay it forward and put those things down. And I preach these three things to my daughters. One's going to grad school. One just left Furman to study abroad this past week in Japan. And I've got a little one who's going to be the death of me, who's a freshman at First Baptist. So as much as I tell them this stuff, boy, wouldn't it be neat if I could put it in a book for them, but also for the folks that I've been mentoring. Lawyers, engineers, business people at work, so I don't sound like the broken record every time. I can just say, read the book. And they say, I don't read books, I listen to audiobooks. I say, gotcha, it's on audio. I narrated that book, so go get it.
I love it. Well, so what is it that you hope people, other than perhaps your daughters, but that others take away, or the lessons they get from this book?
Yeah, I really hope that, again, it helps people, not only lawyers, because people say, well, it's all about the military. No, it's not. It's about lawyers, it's about the military, it's about the pilots, it's about civilian corporations, it's about entrepreneurs and business people. How do you have that level of excellence? And quite honestly, the biggest thrill for me has been in the last couple of weeks. Yesterday was release day, so 350 pre-orders went flying out from Amazon. And they've sucked up all of my inventory, and that's why I'm glad Buxton Books is here, because I want people to buy books from Buxton Books. I like Amazon books, but Buxton is where we want to buy. But I want people, and what really warms my heart is when I find somebody, someone that I don't know around the world, and they email me or they connect with me on LinkedIn, and they say, got your book, I really enjoyed this chapter. That is really, really neat.
Yeah. Well, and I will say that as well. I was struck by every single principle that Mark sets in the book. I agree with, and was fascinated just because I don't have a military background, haven't worked for a Fortune 100 company, and realizing that the principles know no boundaries in terms of whatever your path may be, public service, in any arena. The examples that you give are from your experiences, but this truly is a gift to early career, and maybe even then some. I think there are lessons too to be learned on both sides.
Yeah, if you read the preface, it sort of is aimed for that, right? The publisher says, who's your audience? Well, my audience is really twofold. One is early career folks who want to figure out how to promote, but secondarily, it's what I would call, the current leaders, many of whom are in this room, right? These aren't going to be lessons that are new to you, but I hope you can see yourself in those stories and figure out what I call, are we going to be legacy leaders? Is someone 30 years from now going to want to write a book about us? Will we have passed on that culture where somebody remembers that at the end of every day you thanked them, you took care of them, you corrected them when they were going astray? So that's sort of where I ended up with two sides. I've got a bunch of friends who are retired Navy and senior lawyers and senior business people reading it, and they're laughing. They say, yeah, that's exactly who I want to be. Right? I don't want to be a screamer. I want to be the person at the end of the day that people remember in a positive way.
So you served 30 years in the Navy, retiring as a captain, much of that in the Navy Reserves, while you had your law career as well. How did the lessons that you learned from the Admiral impact your reserve career and your legal career?
Yeah, that again leads to why did I write it? Because everything I was doing as an aide, I would do as a reservist, right? So if I got to go away for a drill weekend, I'm thinking ahead of where I got to be, what I got to do, what I got to pack. Because you get down to Jacksonville without, the black shoes, you got to have the black shoes at midnight on Friday night, you're in trouble, right? So that level of preparedness and execution. And I was just very fortunate. By 2004, 2005, I became, that meticulous attention to detail, being kind to people, allowed me to be the CO of the squadron. Fast forward to law school, work for Judge Norton, very important to do things like page check your documents, make sure things are timely as a lawyer, treat people well, but hold them accountable. And then same thing in the corporation. I'm now very fortunate to work for the world's largest aerospace company. I brief, twice a year I brief the board of directors and members of the board of directors. And you better know what you're doing when you go into that room, right? You better know what you're doing when you go before Judge Cherry. You better know everybody in the room. You better be the best prepared. Those were the habits that I picked up on that I thought were so very beneficial.
Well, thinking of those habits, I'm going to throw you a little curveball and ask you about the concept of complacency. Because you reference that in the book. Because so much of what you see coming through the book talks about preparation and being prepared, not going into the courtroom without having been there before, not taking the Admiral somewhere new without having driven the route before, and leaving yourself enough time. But you give some examples of complacency and being mindful not to let that happen.
Yeah, there were both times where, again, I thought I was going to get fired.
Sorry to keep circling
No,
back to
that's
that
so much fun. So, and I know Jim's here from our East Coast Pilots Association, but all of this transfers into flying too, right? You take off, you've got your takeoff checklist, you got your landing checklist, you're always thinking ahead where the plane's going to be. Complacency in naval aviation, we used to have this big sign right outside of Pensacola. They would replace it every month for the aviation students. One of them I never will forget said, thunderstorms can rip your wings off. Well, as a young junior officer, I was like, yeah, okay, I got that. That makes sense. Next month it was, if there's doubt, there's no doubt. And I didn't understand what that meant. So let's just go to happy hour at the club on Friday afternoon. And now I know what if there's doubt, there's no doubt. It's the most conservative route. And the other one was complacency kills, right? When you're in aviation, complacency is not a good thing. Just working for the Admiral, two instances of complacency. One time we had a one-week trip, and he was speaking in California. It was 3 to 4 different locations, 3 to 4 different uniforms. California, New Orleans, Jacksonville. Leave Maine on a Sunday afternoon. Yeah, California, New Orleans, Jacksonville, and then come back. The last thing we had to do was go to Jacksonville. He wasn't a speaker at all. He was just we were going to sit in a room just like this in a change of command ceremony. And I was just so happy to be done. So we get on the plane out of New Orleans, a little bitty Navy charter plane. It's hotter than blazes. It's 4 or 5 in the morning. We got to get to Jacksonville in time for what we call the pre-T, the VIP get-together before the change of command. And he looks at it and said, we're about 2 hours in the air. And he says, what time is the pre-T? And I said, boss, it's at 10 o'clock. And then he looks down at his watch and looks at me and he says, that's in 15 minutes. I had no idea what was going on. And then I had an idea what was going on. I completely miscalculated the 1 hour time difference between New Orleans and Jacksonville. Complacency had set in. And I calculated, I'd given the people a takeoff time, but I didn't give them a landing time. And he just looked at me, as he often did, and he said, don't ever let this happen again. I said, yes, sir.
And you didn't.
We didn't, but we landed, and some poor sailor was standing there. He'd been there over an hour and a half, standing by a car waiting for us. And I just felt so bad because Jacksonville was 100-something degrees, and this kid just pouring down sweat. And he said, Admiral, I didn't think y'all were going to show up. So good to see you. And he goes, don't worry about it. Luke always takes care of it. And he's like, oh gosh. The other one was, doing a speech for the Admiral. I had to photocopy his speeches right before in the old days. He would have his speech. We had this fail-safe method because back then, junior officers in the squadron would try and get to the Admiral's speech and do something which would not be appropriate in this day and age. Maybe slip something in the speech from a pinup magazine or something. So as they were turning the speech, that would show up, right? We would also take the cold glass of water and put pure grain alcohol in it. So when they take the drink of water. Long story short, the Admiral would hand me his speech 15 minutes before the change of command. I would run down the hall to the administrative offices, make 2 copies real quick. I would then give him the original. I would take a copy, and then I would take a copy and run down to the podium and insert it in the manual, the podium, the speaker's binder. I've got 5 minutes left. You know, everybody's standing up, they're starting, all the pomp and circumstances going on. I run back on, get his sword on, do this, do that. He walks down and introduces him. And I'd always sit line of sight of the Admiral. You don't ever lose sight of the Admiral. So he's giving the speech, which I drafted, and I knew it very well because I timed it, I drafted it, we had time dates to meet. And he flips the page, and he looks right at me. And then he goes off the text of the speech, just starts talking. I'm like, ooh, this isn't good. And then he flips the page again about 30 seconds later, and he's back on. So after it's all over, pomp and circumstance, the band's playing, I go running up, he hands me his cover, hands me his gloves, stuff we always used to do, takes off his sword, he hands it to me. People are congratulating him, someone comes up and says, Admiral, it was a great speech. He goes, thank you very much. Luke wrote it for me here. And then he leaned down and said, how did I do? As he often did, right? He always wanted me to give him my honest opinion. So at that time, my honest opinion was, Admiral, about 5 minutes into it, you kind of went off key and you don't ever do that. And he goes, I know. It was missing page 12. Oh. Don't ever let that happen. And then he said, he often used to say, better to be lucky than good, Luke. But you know, in the old days, so the photocopy machine would go, 2 pages, you got stuck, I put on page. Never again did I not do a document with the court or in law without checking it. And I got to tell you all this. Many of you know the general counsel of the Boeing company, David Ginn, I know he's here, and some of my colleagues are Boeing here. About 7 or 8 years ago, he flew into town and was doing a big speech at Boeing because we were announcing something major. Same thing, he's editing the speech right before he's giving it, and he boom, boom, boom. I give it to him, and he looks at me, and this is my clue to, he says, is everything correct? I said, yes, sir. And he goes, did you page check it? I said, yes, sir. I've been page checking for 25 years.
Experience is the best teacher.
Never did.
So there are a couple of more things I want to ask you, but they say you can learn a lot about an author by the acknowledgments and dedications. And so tell me, to whom is your book dedicated and why?
Yeah, it's dedicated to Mom and Dad. And this is difficult, but I wish Mama was here today. Many of you know that, while I was writing the book in the middle of COVID and near the end of COVID, she picked up as a wonderful lady who used to walk downtown all the time. She got ALS. So very fortunate that me, my dad, my brother, and my sister were able to help her to the very end. And I got to the point in the book where the editor says, look, you've got to read the book out loud, right? The best way, even when you're doing a legal plea, the best way to catch your mistakes is read the book out loud. So I would go over to Bishop Gadsden and I'd bring in the manuscript for the book. And Mom at that point, who could very barely talk, she would look at me and say, book. So I started reading chapters of the book to her, and I'm happy that I got through the entire book reading it to Mom. And a couple times I said, Mama, you're too tired for the book. We're not going to do book. And Mom said, book. So I say in the acknowledgement, in the dedication, Mom was my first teacher. She was a fierce defender of our family of 5. At the age of 82, she was diagnosed with ALS. It is an incredibly cruel disease that slowly takes your body, but not your mind. Never once did she complain. I read this book out loud to her in its final stages. She gave me a thumbs up and said, good book, she tried to say. I love her and miss her dearly. Dad never left her side during that time. My first book is dedicated to Mom and Dad.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Maybe there's lessons that you learn from parents in the future. So you talked about reading the book out loud, and you made reference to the audiobook, and I understand that you read the audiobook. Tell me a little bit about that. How was that?
Yeah, it was the most fatiguing thing I've ever done. Those who publish books know this. It is my audiobook producer was a young gentleman in the UK. So this is how this works. He had the manuscript. He pulls it up on my computer. We're on a Zoom call. He's recording. He's done about 100 audiobooks. He started doing podcasts. After doing the sound check, we're on Audible and Zoom, I start reading. And as soon as I make a mistake, he doesn't say anything, he just highlights the mistake. It's almost like a Pavlovian dog reaction. It's like a shock. So I might have said dog, and it should have been dogs. And he's listening that closely, he'll highlight it. That's my cue to go back and start reading. So there were 5 sessions doing this. Each one was 2 hours long. And then we had a pickup session, and he could hear everything, and he worked absolute masterful job with the book. The only time he would interrupt me is if he heard something that was just too loud. So one time he said, "Hey, Bob." I said, "Yes." He goes, "Did a FedEx truck just go by?" I said, "Oh, it's actually a UPS truck, but yes." You got to read that over. And then the other time he said, "What did you have for breakfast?" Because my stomach was growling. He says, "Don't do that again next time." But he did a great job. And over 12 hours of recording produced the audiobook, which is 3 hours and 39 minutes long.
So would you do it again?
Absolutely. Well, the publisher said, "Mark, you reading your book or voice talent reading your book is about the same cost, and we've got plenty of voice talent. What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, how can voice talent read my book better than I can read my book?" So that's the lawyer be thinking. Well, they can, right? But to me, it was critically important to put my voice into the book. And you'll see there's about 15 different characters that appear in the book, not only the Admiral, but other characters. So I've tried to change my voice to reflect how I remembered them 30 years ago. And I had a good friend this morning text me from Dallas and say it was the absolute right decision. He said, "Great job with the voices." And Rory once stopped me and he says, "You just use that voice, that's the wrong voice." So, he was not only listening for errors, he was listening for tone, inflection, and voice. But I would do it again. It was incredibly fatiguing. Bottle of water, chapstick for the lip smack. He says, "You got to have chapstick for lip smack." I said, "What's lip smack?" He says, "You got too much of it. Get some chapsticks."
I love it. All right, well, so I asked, would you? How about just the concept of another book?
Yeah.
Do you have one in the works?
Yes. It's always an interesting timing thing, and I'm hoping the next one would be easier. I have probably about 5 more in my head, and they're all sort of the same theme. This one is Lessons from the Admiral. I've got one called Lessons from the Judge, not you, but Judge Norton. There's 3 or 4 other ones. Probably the next one up would be Lessons from the Judge, because Judge Norton, as you and I both know, was equally as kind and fair and a demanding boss as the Admiral. He was sort of my first foray into law. So I wrote an article in the South Carolina Bar Journal a couple of years ago called Lessons from the Judge, or What I Learned from the Judge, or something like that. And it was very well received, and I've already got permission from the South Carolina Bar to use that and expand from that. But I've got to get some sleep, sell this book, and find some time first. Because Molly said, "Do you still work for the world's largest aerospace company?" I said, "Yes, I am." And they allow me to do this on my own time. I'm on vacation this week, but timing is a big issue, but it's a passion, and it's what drives me right now.
Good. Well, I wanted to circle back and ask, you referred to yourself as Loop.
Yeah.
So for anyone not in the military who may not know what looping, I know because I read the book, but I did not know beforehand. So tell us what that
means. So our French speakers are going to have to correct me because I took Spanish, but when you see an aide, and we saw a bunch of them in the inauguration, right? They're wearing a gold and blue braid. It's a very simple loop when you're just wearing a working uniform. When you're at the inauguration, you'll see we used to call it the anaconda snake. It's a bunch of loops wrapped all the way around. We saw a bunch of them. The folks, actually the young Marine escorting the First Lady was a Citadel graduate, and he was wearing a loop the other day when we were watching the inauguration. So it's called an aiguillette. Now, my French speaking people are going to have to help me, because when I got to that in the book. You know, I've used it in the book, but when I started narrating the book, I didn't know how to pronounce it. And I said, Rory, how do you pronounce this word? He goes, I don't know. So we go to Google and we figure out. That's what it is. It's an old traditional gold and blue braid. Mine had 2 loops, so it's 2 loops that hang down under your shoulder. The more stars the Admiral has, the bigger the loop. So if you work for a 2 or a 3-star Admiral, you get 3 braids. You work for the President or the Chief of Naval Operations, you have 4 braids, 5 braids. And the neat thing about that is, here you are, a young junior officer, going up to people that are very senior to you, telling them what needs to be done, and expecting it to get done. And what signifies to them to get it done? The loop. So the loop is, and that's what he called me. He just would say, hey Luke, come here. Hey Luke, come up this way. That's I tried to say, yes sir.
Well, there was one other, well, I learned a lot from reading the book, but one thing that stuck out to me was the word scuttlebutt.
Yeah.
I did not know that that was originated from the Navy, but you talk about scuttlebutt in the book. So tell us where the word comes from and what you learned regarding scuttlebutt.
Yeah, this is another lesson, right? So, and it's, and I tell my kids this, and I often try to remember this at home. Scuttlebutt is what we would call gossip, water cooler talk, stuff you're just talking to people about that you probably shouldn't talk about. And the Admiral was very clear that, what I saw, what I heard, when I was with him as a civilian or with his family or an official Navy function was all his business, not my business. So no scuttlebutt. Check, got it. So we're getting ready to go on a trip one Saturday or Sunday. Always had to have a haircut. Always had to be military, uniform inspection ready because everybody's looking at you. You're the Admiral. Say shoes shine, uniform square away, haircut. We get ready to leave, and I go by the base barber shop on a Saturday afternoon. Jack was the barber there. Those that have been in the military, you all know a Jack. He's in the barber. Gives me a quick haircut, $275 back then. He says, what are you doing tonight? I said, I'm going over to the Admiral's house. He's having one of our, the senior chief on our staff is getting married, and he's actually going to do the vows, and we're going to do it in his quarters, And he goes, oh, that's just great. So, and then I told him we were leaving on the trip, just chatting with Jack. Jack was chatting. So I pick up the Admiral, 0600 Tuesday, Monday morning to go on the trip, and he looks at me and he says, nice haircut, Luke. And I said, well, thank you, boss. He goes, Jack gives a good haircut, doesn't he? And I'm thinking, now how in the world did he know I got my haircut by Jack? Well, the Admiral had gone by to see Jack Sunday. And the first thing Jack said to the Admiral was, how was the wedding last night at your quarters? And the Admiral very quickly reminded me that what goes on at his house when we're in uniform or out of uniform is his business, the business of the Navy Admiral, not my business, no scuttlebutt. And I said, yes, sir.
Well, and I thought that was a fantastic lesson, though.
Yeah.
Not real. There was no malintent. You were just talking and not realizing the information that you were sharing.
Well, how often do we do that at work, right? We call it water cooler talk now. We're just shooting the bull about what you're doing or what you're doing over the weekend or who you saw or, exactly, no malintent, but sometimes you've got to put on that filter and say, maybe I shouldn't be talking about this.
Well, one of the things that I took away also reading the book when you talked about now needing some sleep, I wondered if you ever had time to relax and not become complacent, but there's so much that you had to anticipate and plan and prepare for. Did you have time, your own time, your downtime?
As an aide? Yes. This was. I love trips to Washington, D.C., and here's why. My Admiral was a 1-star Admiral when I first started working for him. There are 3- and 4-star Admirals and Generals in Washington, D.C. that don't have aides. I mean, they just don't. They don't rank one. They don't even have restrooms in the Pentagon in their office. That's how heavy D.C. is with Admirals. So he did not want me to be seen when we got to Washington, D.C., which was wonderful for me, right? So I'd get him off the plane and drive over to the Washington Navy Yard. He'd have 3 days of meetings in the Pentagon. I would set up executive flag travel for him to get back and forth. And he would just say, get lost. I'll see you Wednesday morning. And that's it. Can you imagine a young single guy with 3 days of Washington, D.C.? One time I stayed out a little bit too late, and it caught up with me. But that was wonderful. And he just knew it. He just knew, look, I'm not showing up as a one-star admiral with an A when these 3 or 4 stars don't even have A's. You go take a break. And he'd tell me what time to be back, and I would.
But you had carved out, you had your time.
Yeah.
So, well, one of the things that I particularly enjoyed about reading the book was the first chapter when you talk about, I think it was maybe your first week on the job, when you're meeting with the Admiral and learning his expectations. And I think that you called it later, maybe the initial guidance from him. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? And then I think we've got enough time before we take questions and wrap things up for you to maybe read an excerpt.
That'd be great.
From that first chapter.
Yeah, and this is something else I took away from the job. So I was in there about 2 weeks. I had a fire hose turnover with a guy named Clyde. Clyde was my predecessor. He was a previous Army Ranger that had transferred to the Navy, so Clyde didn't have a whole lot of a sense of humor. I mean, he was just, I did this, I did that, you know, I try and crack a joke. He says, you can't do that. Anyway, when Clyde had left, footnote, Clyde went on to become a commanding officer in a P-3 squadron, just like I did some 15 or 20 years later. When Clyde had left, I was trying to figure out the staff. I was trying to figure out, you know, okay, Clyde's gone. Everybody, you know, when they backslap you and say, oh, you got big shoes to fill. Clyde was a great agent. Oh, God, here we go. So the game was on, and finally, I was wondering if the Admiral was ever going to tell me what I needed to do. I didn't know what I was doing in this job. I just went around trying to think of what I thought I was supposed to do. I knew I sat at the desk right before everybody came in this door, and one morning he says, come on in the office. Let's talk. And I was like, uh-oh. And then whenever he said that, he said, close the door. That meant it was, you know, we're going to have some serious talk. And that's what he did about the second week. And that's when he gave me what I call the initial guidance. In his office, it's just me and him. I closed the door, right? And I said, I sat in one of the high-backed black leather chairs in front of his desk. After some small talk, the Admiral's tone changed. Let's discuss this job and my expectations, he said. You are going to do a lot of things and see a lot of things as my aide. Many are going to be great, and some are going to be, well, not so great. Many tasks will be well above your pay grade, and others will be well below your pay grade. I need you to perform exceptionally well, whether you're completing a great task or a not so great task. You understand that, Lieutenant? Yes, sir, I understand. As I look back, that was part of what I now call the initial guidance. At that time, I had no idea what I would see or do, but I knew the correct answer was an affirmative one. And it continues in chapter 1. As I sat in front of his desk during my first few weeks as his aide, the Admiral laid out his expectations for me. His initial guidance continued. Be on time. I like to be on time, so let's never be late. You understand that? Yes, sir, I responded. Confidentiality matters. In this job as the Luke, you are an extension of my eyes and ears, he said. You are with me wherever I go. You see and hear what I see and hear, and you remember it. Whatever you see and hear is my business, the business of the Navy Admiral, and no one else's business. You got that? Yes, sir, I said. Tell me what I need to hear. I will trust your judgment and rely on you to tell me the truth, he stated. Almost everyone else will agree with me because I am the Admiral. When we are behind closed doors, you can request permission to speak freely, and then we take off the stars and the bars and speak to each other man to man. I will rely on you to keep me out of trouble. Don't let me do anything stupid. Got it? He asked. Yes, sir. He wore the silver bars. I'm sorry. Rory would have corrected me for that one. He wore the silver stars on the collar of his uniform. I wore silver lieutenant bars on railroad tracks, as they call them. Unconditional allegiance. We can agree and disagree behind closed doors, but once I make a decision, the discussion is over. You support and execute that decision. Got it? Yes, sir. And then the stars belong to the Admiral. Now these stars are mine, he said, pointing to the silver stars in his collar. You can use them, but use them sparingly, if and only when you have to. You understand that, Luke? Yes, sir, I understand, I said. Good, he said. Do these things, and we will get along just fine. This conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. It was the most important conversation of my 17 months as an Admiral's aide, and one of the most important in my life as a naval flight officer, a lawyer, and a leader.
I think we've got some time for questions.
Mark, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. And Molly, great job. I have to admit, I am so jealous of the clarity of your memory, not only with this book, but also with the one you wrote, what you're writing about Judge Norton. And so my question is, did you have a diary or anything like that while you were doing all this? Or do you just have an amazing memory that I'm just going to be jealous of?
Yeah, listen, thank you. That is Charleston School of Law professor. I'm going to use her maiden name, Allison Haynes, because that's how I remember her. But she has been at Charleston School of Law for years, and like Molly and I, clerk for Judge Norton. So thank you for the question. Thank you so much for being here for what you're doing at CSOL. About 5 or 6 years, maybe right after law school, I had one of those old first-generation electric typewriters that had a big disc that you could stick in the side, you know, and I thought it was really cool because we could finally record stuff on a disc that was a big Smith on it, but you still had to type. And I typed about 15 or 20 pages of this in an outline form. Those pages are yellow and crinkled and crackling, and I took those during COVID and expanded it into probably 20, 30 some odd chapters, cut it down to 19, and I did talk to my friend who appears in the book as a JAG, and I said, look, that's the other reason why I didn't give the book to the Admiral, because I was like, I think this is the way it happened, but I'm just not sure. So the JAG, who's my buddy, who recruited me to go be the Admiral's aide, and then went on to be a Navy Admiral JAG himself, and then went on to be a dean at George Washington University School of Law. Hank Molinaro, his name appears in a blurb in the book. He said, put this language in here. He said, and you'll be covered. He said, the author has tried to recreate events, locales, and conversation from his memories of them. The conversation in the book are not written to represent word-for-word transcripts. And then we go on with a wonderful discussion about me changing the names, blah, blah, blah. And Hank said, do that and you'll be just fine. So,
I told you you can't take the lawyer hat off.
no, it's just, and you know, God bless Hank, he had me over he taught me to go to Maine. I was lonely in Maine by myself on Sundays. He would invite me over to his house on Sunday afternoon in snow-covered roads of Brunswick, Maine, with his 2-year-old daughter Jessie there. And now Hank and Fran are living in the heartland of America, 2 doors down from Jessie, who's now a mom of 5 kids. And that's a thank you.
Hey Mark, my name is Morris Morrison. I was invited by my brother Jerry Stilley here.
Thank you.
My boy, Bill Collie. I'm a professional speaker and a writer, and I gotta say, first of all, I could not imagine if you would have allowed anybody else to read your book. So for anyone who's had the audio book, can you just give him a round of applause? My question is this, and I know as a writer, there are things that always surprise me. So 2 questions. What moments in the book while you were writing made you cry and get emotional? And also, what did you learn as you wrote the book that completely caught you off guard and surprised you?
Yeah. Well, of course, thank you so much for being here. I've had a number of conversations with Jerry. Heard all about you. Jerry is going to publish a book here shortly, and it has allowed me to look at his manuscript, and it's a phenomenal book. I know you've done the same. So, gosh, what made me cry? Obviously, the dedication, and I don't know if I can talk any more about that because I might start crying today. But as far as what made me pretty emotional with the Admiral, it was just, you know, I got to the point where I've got to make this decision. You know, I'm going to either, you'll see in the end of the book, the dilemma is he comes in one morning and he says, I'm picking up a 2nd star. I want you to come to Norfolk, Virginia with me. I am like 3 months into looking at law schools, and I hadn't told him yet. I'd already taken the LSAT, he goes, I know you're just as surprised about this as I am. Sleep on it tonight, and I'll talk about it. We can talk about it tomorrow. So I called Dad that night. I said, Dad, I don't know what I'm going to do. Admiral's Aid, back then, the Admiral's Aid said they were getting out of the Navy. They were relieved or fired, right? Because you're the prima donna, and it doesn't look good to be out to do that. And Dad said to me, he said, Mark, he said, you're a great aide. He said, you'd be a great lawyer. You do what your heart tells you to do, and it'll be okay. Because as soon as you walk out that door, and this is true for civilian world, for military world, for business world, they will replace you with somebody else, right? And that next morning, read the book and see what the Admiral said when he said the next morning, he walks in, taps on my desk, says, come on in the office, you coming with me? And I sat in that same black high chair to have a conversation with the Admiral about wanting to go to law school. And I'll go ahead and let the cat out of the bag. He looks at me and he says, he has his cheaters on, he says, can I change your mind? And I said, no, sir. He goes, you mean get out of the Navy? And I said, yes, sir. It's not really get out of the Navy. I'm going to the reserves, Admiral. And he says, I can't talk you out of it. I said, no, sir. Then he said, or she says to me, what can I do to help you? Wow. What can I do to help you, right? And I think that was, to answer the first question, the one that really, remembering that moment and taking that forward as a leader, that when someone's faced with a decision, especially as they're leaving you, helping them out the door, right? And making sure that you take care of them. What can I do to help you? I knew other aides that were resigning to go into the reserves. They were relieved the next day. You just give me the loop, go take a temporary staff position. You're in the back office now. And he didn't do that. And the second part, I think what surprised me is, there were some things that I just sort of, on the other side of it, I just sort of laughed about, right? We flew in a congressman once to have a briefing. Well, the briefing really was, quite honestly, a fishing junket. The congressman wanted to come in on a weekend to have a fishing junket, but it was all covered by the JAG, it's all legal. It was a rest and relaxation trip for this congressman. And just remembering that event and that fishing trip, because the Admiral called me into his office and he said, look, this guy's a big deal. He's a Navy veteran, and we got to have a good trip for him. And I just want you to sit on the dock with the brick. Well, the brick was the big black walkie-talkie, right? It was huge. And get the bait and get the drinks. And I said, okay, you just want me to be dock boy for the day? I can do that. So I mean, just getting tickled about things like that I did. But that was one of the jobs that I did that was probably below my pay grade. But you better believe I was a damn good dock boy that day. So thank you for your question.
Hi, Mark. Fantastic job. Looking forward to reading your book. I think I know the answer to this question since you and I have similar backgrounds. But did you reach a point in kind of more your civilian work that you realized working with those around you, for some of the companies you've worked for as well, that those lessons that you learned were absolutely applicable and could be of use to those working with you? Was there a point that light bulb went off and you said, I think I need to capture those right this moment?
Yeah, it was an evolution, right? So I call him Air Boss. He used to have the East Field Pilot Association, another wonderful retired Air Force colonel, right? Flew here in Charleston. And I think we slowly realized that over time. And for me, just the things started to click. And that's when, I figured that out. Being timely at the law firm mattered. Showing up on time at Delta mattered. Knowing what the hell I was doing on 9/11 mattered. When things started getting really bad that day, I knew exactly where to go, exactly where to do it because we had drilled it so many times. When the pager went off and the general counsel looked at me and said, something's not right, we knew exactly what we needed to do, but all of that was the same thing that I executed in the military. I hope that answers the question. I don't think it was an immediate, this is everything I used to do. It was just over time. So, gosh, General Counsel above me asked me 20 years later, did you page check? You damn right I page checked. But that was not something I ever realized I was doing. It was just part of the habit. And I did that same thing when I would file electronic pleading with the judge, because you still have to scan an electronic pleading back in the day, right? You couldn't just convert it to PDF. So thank you. And thank you for your service.
I'd like to ask, I know we don't want to self-deprecating story, but can you share with us a story where Luke saved the day?
Gosh, yeah, I talk about using the loop, right? And again, I'm going to go back to DC because in DC we wanted to be low key, so we would fly into Andrews Air Force Base, and I would be. This is the old days where you're calling for a reservation for the car, right? There's no app, there's no online, and I'd say, look, I want a 4-door sedan. I don't want anything fancy. I want, I want this, I want that, and they would pull the vehicle up to the planes that were landed, but it was a civilian. And it was a wonderful civilian who had immigrated to the country within the last couple of years. Very nice. I got, Muhammad was his name. We got to know each other on first terms because he knew I was very meticulous. And one day we pull up and I'm looking out the window of the plane and there's this huge Cadillac. And I'm like, oh Jesus, please, don't be our car. Muhammad waves at me, gives me a thumbs up, and drives over to the car. The Admiral looks at me and says, is that our car? Because again, we don't want to drive to the Washington Navy Yard in a big Cadillac, where aides aren't even existing. We're going to the visiting flag quarters, which at the Navy Yard is where all the admirals stay, and we would be the junior admiral. And that's not a good thing, It's not a good thing to have an aide pulling up in a Cadillac. And I get out and he says, I said, you got any other cars? He says, yes. He says, but for you, my friend Mark, he says, I upgrade you to Cadillac today. I said, oh, God. I said, I don't need no Cadillac. I said, and he said, you gold member, you get Cadillac. I said, man, I can't do it. So I looked at him and said, and I didn't have a loop, but he knew at that time it was a loop. And I said, look, I gotta get a different car. He said, no. So I told the Admiral, I said, look, I'm just gonna get you. So I got into the Navy Yard, went flying back over down 295 back to Andrews, got another low-key car. But I had to tell him like 3 times. I had to use the stars and I had to use the loop. I finally had to say, look, the Admiral wants this, because he was convinced he was doing the right thing. And never again did we have a Cadillac.
Well, that was Mark, thank you so much for your time today.